Great. Thank you, Lonnie, and thank you all for being here. It is an honor to be with you, and I'm really excited to be able to talk with you more about StriveTogether and to particularly engage in a conversation about our work through some Q&A a little bit later. But I'm thrilled that the Institute is doing the work that you're doing. This is really important for advancing the type of work that we're doing in communities, and so grateful to have this opportunity. So I'm going to start with a story. It began 13 years ago when one brutally honest statement changed the way that I think about my life's work. It was 5 years after a race riot had devastated the city of Cincinnati. That riot shook many of us to our core and really exposed some deep fractures in our community. The good news is that out of that experience, people came together to begin the process of healing. And they came together from all sectors. Leaders at all levels of the community came to the table. We squarely confronted the difficult issues and committed ourselves to finding solutions. Many of those solutions have had an immediate impact, but there was another benefit to the work because a few years later, when the community saw a need again to improve outcomes for children in the urban core of Cincinnati and northern Kentucky, we knew that cross-sector collaboration was the way to approach this type of work. It was in our DNA in Cincinnati. And so once again, a group of cross-sector partners and leaders came together to solve a complex problem. Initially, we did what most groups do. We started to search for a new program. But funders in the community were skeptical. They were already funding a lot of programs and not seeing the results that they wanted to see. They wanted to see results. And business leaders were adamant. They said, you cannot program your way out of a complex situation. If you really want to figure out how to improve outcomes for children, we need to start with the data. And then community leaders were conflicted. We each believed that we had the silver bullet solution that could solve the problem. And for me, that was college access. You see, I'm a first-generation college student, and so my college education was my ticket toward economic mobility. And so I spent the early part of my career really working to bring cross-sector partners together to support the transition from high school to college. And so up until that point, that's how I had focused my career. And so my silver bullet solution to put on the table was another college access program. But in the end, it took one person, a person who deals with the darkest sides of inequity in our community, to help us all see a bigger and far more important picture. And his name was Dr. Odell Owens. He was the county coroner at the time. And he listened to our discussions about results and our pitches for new programs, and then he cut to the chase. I still remember what he said word for word to this day. He said, if you start at high school to college, it's too late. The only result that you're going to get if you don't start at birth is more dead kids on my table. That statement stopped me and most other community members in our tracks, and that image has never left my mind. Nor has the clarity about the need to focus on the cradle forward. And so that's why I'm here today. Improving outcomes from cradle to career is the vision and the work of StriveTogether. And I believe more strongly than ever that it is the right approach to putting children on the path to economic mobility. And we should all care about this. After all, and economic mobility is the American dream. But there are those who claim, particularly recently, that the American dream no longer exists. And at StriveTogether, we refuse to accept that. We fundamentally refuse to settle for a world in which a child's future is determined by the conditions into which they are born. Zip code cannot and should not define one's destiny. It certainly shouldn't define whether or not a child ends up on a county coroner's table. Ensuring pathways to economic mobility for every child has become our North Star. And we approach this work with an incredible sense of passion and urgency. Today, I'm going to share our journey with you. I'll share some incredible stories of progress and impact that we're seeing across the country. And I'll leave you with a few parting thoughts as I look back on our journey thus far. Let's begin with an explanation of who we are, what we believe, why we believe what we do, and how we do what we do. StriveTogether is a movement with purpose. As I said earlier, we simply refuse to settle for a world in which a child's potential is dictated by race, income, zip code, or circumstance. Our job is to break down barriers, to change systems, and to improve outcomes for as many families as possible. We're a national network focused on ensuring that every child succeeds from cradle to career. We work through community partnerships, 67 of them today, nationwide, across 29 states, in places like Tacoma, Washington, Austin, Texas, Albany, New York, Washington, D.C., Spartanburg, South Carolina, Dayton, Ohio, Cincinnati, where our framework first emerged, and then 4 communities right here in Wisconsin: Green Bay, Kenosha, Racine, and Milwaukee. And we are so fortunate that there are representatives from all 4 of these partnerships here with us today. They are the true heroes on the ground doing the work. If you could wave, because I think if we do have some robust Q&A after, I would love for you to get to join us at the reception and talk with these individuals who are doing the incredible work that we're doing to reach 14 million kids nationwide. And more than 8 million of those kids reached by our network are children of color. And although we're a national network, we're not a monolithic organization. I may be chief executive officer, or I may be CEO of the organization, but I'm far more chief engagement officer than chief executive officer of StriveTogether, because our role at StriveTogether is to support every single partnership and every single community doing this hard work on the ground to achieve the results that their communities and their kids deserve. And it's hard work, but there's nothing more important or more urgent. I'm going to tell you how we do it in a few minutes, but first I want to start with why we do what we do and why we feel such an incredible sense of urgency about this work. Earlier I made the statement that many people believe that the American dream no longer exists, that the possibility of every person achieving success and upward mobility is no longer possible. And if you look at the data, it's kind of hard to disagree with this belief. Take, for example, recent data shared by world-renowned economist Raj Chetty and his peers on the state of opportunity in America. The American dream is indeed fading. The majority of Americans born in 1940 ended up better off than their parents. Yet only half of those born since 1980 will surpass their parents' income. According to Chetty's data, as you can see here, place matters. We'll get into this later when I walk you through our approach, but this data shows just how clearly place influences upward mobility. The data documents the long-lasting effects of childhood poverty and shows that a child's neighborhood has an impact on his or her path toward mobility. Next, and equally unsurprising to those of us working in communities, race matters. According to Chetty's data, race is a critical factor for mobility, and it's often tightly linked with place, but not always. There was a study published recently, last year actually, called Race and Economic Opportunity in the United States, and the findings of this study were startling. The authors found that even when children grow up next to each other with parents who earn similar incomes, black boys fare worse than white boys in 99% of the country. And what's even more staggering is that while outcomes overall improve, the gap actually widens in lower poverty neighborhoods. This data paints a grim picture of reality, but not all of the data that Raj Chetty and his team have put out is discouraging. Actually, there's additional data coming out from the Chetty research that shows that education matters. This is not a surprise to anyone in this room, I'm sure, but it's potentially as much as a place and race. And this is very encouraging for those of us doing this cradle-to-career work and taking this approach. Really, a high-quality education helps to boost outcomes, starting at the pre-K level. An experienced kindergarten teacher can boost earnings by more than $1,000 on average. And then, of course, we all know this, a college education acts as a leveler. It dramatically reduces the correlation between parents' incomes and the adult incomes of their children. And this is true not only for elite colleges, but other four-year institutions and community colleges. Yet, despite billions of public and private resources invested each year in quality education and support for children, our systems continue to fail us. They continue to produce outcomes that leave the American dream in decline. Our hypothesis at StriveTogether is that for far too long, systems and sectors have blamed one another for bad outcomes instead of working together. This cartoon from our partnership in Albuquerque sums it up perfectly. As you can see here, the different sectors blaming one another for the outcomes we're seeing. Does this feel familiar to anyone doing this work? It definitely does to me. Instead of sharing accountability for solving a problem, all too often we find ourselves pointing fingers. We hold others accountable, but not ourselves. And so what we do at StriveTogether is we bring partners and communities together to share accountability and to solve the most complex problems of our time, moving children out of poverty and into mobility. Our approach is simpler than it might seem on the surface. We operate with just 4 simple principles and 1 success framework that we call our theory of action. And this was all built, I should say at the outset, this theory of action has all been built together with our network members. So I got my start with the Strive partnership in Cincinnati, but as we've evolved and grown the network, we've built this success framework together. And so these principles are our foundation. They are where we start. Engage the community, advance equity, develop a culture of continuous improvement, and leverage existing resources. These 4 principles define essentially how we do our work. And the theory of action defines what we do. It's a simple matrix, 4 pillars of work moving through 6 gateways of progress. So this slide is really simple looking. If you have the theory of action handout that we have over there, it's a little bit more complex looking, but trust me, it's much more simple than it looks. The 4 pillars of this framework are shared community vision, evidence-based decision making, collaborative action, and investment in sustainability. And then the gateways are our milestones. So this acts as a roadmap for how we work with partnerships to move them across from building a partnership in a community to getting towards transformation. And there are 6 of these gateways: exploring, emerging, sustaining, systems change, proof point, and systems transformation. The approach is sophisticated, but it's not complicated. Our principles ground us, the gateways guide us, and our pillars drive progress from cradle to career. 2 things make this framework so powerful: its simplicity and its agility. It's simple enough that people from all walks of life can use it, and it's agile enough that it can be adapted for the unique needs of any community, and actually in other sectors as well. We've had a few sectors, like Feeding America has taken our theory of action to see how they might apply it to their work in food security. So it is agile enough to work in other sectors. It also has one very powerful feature, and that is data at its core. Everything that we do is grounded in evidence. Every step we take is focused on proving what's working or not, and then improving from there. We have big ambitions, but we deal with reality. This work is about building lasting civic infrastructure in communities, because this is long-term work. So we have to have the infrastructure in communities. So each of the gateways requires evidence before a community can move to the next gateway. And that evidence drives accountability, and the accountability drives results for kids. And so that, in a nutshell, is who we are, what we believe, and how we work. Every child cradle to career, with better results every step of the way, from kindergarten readiness to early grade reading to middle grade math, to high school graduation and post-secondary enrollment, and from post-secondary completion to a good job. A job that provides economic mobility, especially for kids from families of color and those living in poverty, the people who are most burdened by today's societal systems. This is what StriveTogether is all about. And I appreciate your interest so much, because we need people like you to advance our thinking and really push us on what's working by challenging our assumptions. We will do whatever it takes to get better outcomes for kids and their families, and we welcome any ideas that can improve and accelerate the progress to help communities get there. So in that spirit, we're going to take a deeper look at each element of the framework. And I'll try not to go deeper than what's needed, but I do want to drill down far enough so that I can stimulate your thinking and your questions for later. So we're going to start with the principles. Our principles are our bedrock. They're the foundation upon which everything else is built. Our starting principle is engage the community. We believe that real change is rooted in community transformation. As I mentioned earlier, and as was evident in the Chetty data, place matters. So we know from our work on the ground that a community must be engaged and take ownership for improved outcomes for its children and families. And engaging and activating the community requires information and awareness so people can see the value of a partnership. But mainly, it takes a lot of listening. There are so many important and relevant voices in each community. There are, of course, the usual suspects: business leaders, political leaders, community leaders, educators. But the most important voices are those that aren't always heard and aren't always invited, if we're honest. These are the kids and families themselves who we're trying to serve. And we work really hard to make room for them all. Northfield, Minnesota is a great example of this. They have kids sitting on every one of the county's boards and commissions. It's remarkable. These young people speak up and they inform a broad range of issues in the community that affect them, from education to the environment to city planning. Kids are empowered and the community is improved. It's a perfect balance. But you don't have to take my word for it. We'll let them speak for themselves with a short video.
Okay, going on to like Woodley, because that way it would hit more housing and it would be like more accessible to everybody in town.
We now have 97 youth serving on boards and commissions all throughout the city, 22 boards and commissions total, and we are just so thankful for their partnership and their willingness to serve.
I joined because I wanted to see a little more involvement of youth. Every vote counts, even for the students and the adults. They have the same voice no matter what happens.
We are on the Mayor's Youth Council. Right now we are working on voter registration for those seniors that will be 18 by November 6th.
The Mayor's Youth Council is a youth advisory board to the mayor. We give her youth input on certain topics that relates to the community as a whole.
It's really cool to see that the adults care about what my opinion is.
Great. It's a great example, and there are lots of examples like this across the network, because engaging community is about elevating community authority in the work, and hearing all voices, especially youth voices, given the work that we're doing, is critical to getting the outcomes we want to see. Our next principle is to advance equity. Advancing equity, particularly racial equity, is essential. If we don't identify and dismantle the inequities that hold kids back, systemic, cultural, and racial, we have little hope of transforming anything in communities. And to be clear, the disparities that we see in our data are not the fault of children and families. They are the fault of the systems. The systems that exist are getting exactly the results that they were designed to exist. This is why our theory of action focuses not only on improving outcomes and eliminating disparities, but really changing the systems and structures that produce the outcomes that we don't want to see. Taking on structural and systemic inequities is hard work. It's daunting, but it's absolutely essential. And we approach it in three ways. First, we start with the data. When you disaggregate local data and uncover the disparities and inequities, you quickly realize that the challenges in a community are systemic. Next, we work really hard to change mental models and help people see the things that they haven't seen or acknowledged in what they're doing. And finally, we work to shift power dynamics and help people see the benefits of those changes. One of the ways to shift power dynamics is giving voice to youth, as you just saw in that example. Our goal is to influence more equitable policies throughout a community in education, housing, policing, healthcare, and so much more. This is how we can create sustainable change. One of the toughest lessons I've learned, however, is just how intractable these things can be. Even in communities where people are coming together with shared convictions, sincere purpose, and an honest desire to help kids and families, getting past things like mental models and shifting power dynamics is one of the most challenging issues we face. And while data is always the starting point, it's usually human stories that move people to a new place. So here's an example from San Antonio about how youth engagement and voice is shifting power structures to influence policymaking in a community.
Now, I was on the San Antonio Youth Commission last year, and I did it for about 2 years when I was in high school. And I was one of the 2 youth commissioners for District 8, so I worked directly with the city council, and I worked with the councilman who was the representative of district. And basically, we're the voice for the youth. We offer an outlet for youth to be able to speak to us and inform us about issues and topics that they feel that is necessary for the city council to tackle. And so we're kind of like the middleman between the greater youth of San Antonio and city council, who actually does implement and make policies and legislation that affects directly the people living within the county. And so we allow the youth to speak to us, and we take their input to the city council.
It's so cool. I was actually in San Antonio last week with our partnership there. They're known as the UP Partnership. That's a new brand for them. Unlocking Potential is what it stands for. But they are hosting this week, actually it might be in the next couple of days, a huge summit, a youth summit, where they'll have 275 young people, but what those young people are doing are they're using design thinking to really help inform policy in Greater Bexar County in Texas. So it's incredible work that they're doing there, and really until we give voice to those impacted by the changes we're seeking to make, there's no way for us to get past go. This is why advancing equity in the work is a foundational core principle and not just a goal for the work that we're doing. Our third principle is developing a culture of continuous improvement. And our methodology adapts and integrates tools from a diverse mix of sources. The Institute for Healthcare Improvement Model for Improvement, the Annie Casey Foundation's Results Count approach, human-centered design thinking, all held with racial equity lens in the work. Those are sort of the components that comprise our approach, but I have to say that as we're advancing this methodology in the field, we learn and adapt as we go, and we learn so much from the work on the ground that's happening in communities. But this unique combination removes common barriers, arms communities with knowledge and tools, and drives continuous collaborative improvement. In Salt Lake City, for example, we've been working very closely with our partnership there to tackle chronic absenteeism. And this has been a particular issue in grades K through 3 as it relates to moving more kids towards grade level reading proficiency. And this matters because, of course, reading at grade level by third grade is the #1 predictor of college and career success. And I'm sure you've probably heard that awful statistic that they use those numbers to determine how many prisons to build in this country, which speaks volumes about the importance of the work that we're doing in communities. But it goes without saying that kids who are chronically absent are not able to stay on track with reading proficiency. So that's why chronic absenteeism is actually a very important contributing indicator in so much of the work that our communities do. So we worked with Promise Partnerships of Salt Lake City to build their capability in improvement science, which is one of the tools in our toolbox. And we know that there's not a silver bullet solution for reducing absenteeism. So the goal here is to help parents, teachers, guidance counselors, and kids to help them solve the problem for specific populations by using data to identify the best interventions. And so in working with Salt Lake, over the course of a year, we held 7 learning sessions with 6 teams from 8 schools and 3 districts. We were on a mission. We looked at best practices from across the country, but however, we put the most emphasis on the local quantitative and qualitative data. So we really relied on local data and what it showed us could be the best interventions. And we relied on the knowledge of school staff and others who understood the specific needs of their students. We talked with people who were dealing with the problem on a daily basis, parents, students, guidance counselors, and others. And with insights that came from all of these conversations and from all of the data that we studied, the teams then generated and tested a mix of interventions. And they landed on a critical few that could keep more kids in the classroom. And I don't want to pretend like any of this was easy. I'm making it sound much, much more easy than it is. Far from it. In fact, before the partnership could do this, they had to convince a lot of people that improvement science was the way to go. A lot of people automatically assume that improvement science in itself could be overly burdensome, overly complex, particularly for teachers and school administrators who are already overburdened by the amount of data that they have to look at and the responsibilities that they have. But as this community went along, they really found it to be much easier than expected, almost intuitive to their work. And the resistance faded, and the results have been well worth all of the hard work. Chronic absenteeism, especially among students with disabilities, has decreased significantly over the year that followed. And reading proficiency at grade level, at grade 3, has more than doubled from 8 to 17%. But what's, I think, most exciting about this work is the ripple effect, because continuous improvement is now the way these partners work together. And actually, the United Way of Greater Salt Lake, which houses our partnership, the Promise Partnerships of Salt Lake Partnership, they are now really using continuous improvement throughout the organization. So continuous improvement is the commitment, but it's really that collaborative improvement, what I talked about with students and parents and teachers and administrators working together in that spirit. That's what makes all of the difference in this work. The fourth principle is leverage existing resources. This one's really, really simple. The idea here is to not create new programs, which is what everyone always wants to do. What we want to do here is to understand and get the best out of the programs and interventions that work for kids. So this is often the hardest principle to apply. On one hand, communities don't have resources to waste. And yet, I can't think of a single community that doesn't waste a lot of resources every single day. This may be because they're investing in practices that don't work, or duplicating efforts, or failing to share information with one another. But often, communities can't see this waste, or they can't avoid the temptation to create something new. So part of the work is having a delicate conversation, starting with the assumption that the people doing this work and the many nonprofits and providers, others, they're doing this work with the best intentions, but showing them a better way to do this work. And so uncovering where some of those resources are going and how we can better leverage assets in communities, asking people, are we really getting the results that we should be getting by the level of investment that's happening in the community? Unfortunately, the answer is almost always no, which opens the door to a healthy conversation about how we can do more with what we have. And what's most important about these 4 principles is how they work in concert with one another. They're mutually reinforcing, and communities that are guided by them, we know from our data and from doing this work for a few years, they always get off to a much stronger start. Racine, right here in Wisconsin, is a great example. Higher Expectations is the partnership in Racine, and it's one of StriveTogether's proof point partnerships, which means in Racine County, they have at least 3 of 6 outcome areas. You remember those 7 outcomes that I shared earlier that we track for our Cradle to Career Network. They have at least 3. I say 3 of 6 because we added employment, so I always have to remind that. But for Racine, that didn't matter because they started with employment, and I'll get there in a minute. But Higher Expectations is one of our proof point partnerships because they have demonstrated that they have improved outcome or indicators in at least 3 of those outcome areas, and they have examples of systems change. And so this is really the final step before getting to systems transformation, which is our big goal in our work. And getting there is a really big deal. So I'm proud of our partners in Racine. But what I want to share with you about them is they are responding to a changing workforce in the community. And so I mentioned that they've already focused on employment. Actually, Higher Expectations is one of our partnerships that sort of works backwards from career to cradle. And but because, although their ultimate focus is employment, the approach is still the same. And so since 2014, they've actually worked across the community using data to understand the impact that they're having and to focus their efforts and resources on how that data is telling them to focus. And so only about 1/3 of adults in Racine County have a post-secondary credential. And this is, of course, an issue that impacts everyone, but it has a particular impact on the lives of single mothers and their children. So our partners in Racine have decided to focus on that specific population. They are focused, and they're doing a lot of other work, but I'm talking about one specific intervention that we're really interested in. They're focusing on, in particular, on unemployed and underemployed single mothers with children under 5 years old. And they've mobilized a broad mix of partners to create a 2-generational approach. So they're ensuring that moms have access to workforce training programs and high-quality childcare and to support services that they need to succeed. And this work, with its focus on a particularly vulnerable subpopulation, has a tremendous potential to break the cycle of poverty for families. What I also love about their approach is that they are really working with existing partners in the community who know this work well. They're leveraging the existing resources and programs and interventions that are getting results in the community and building on those. And so, of course, we look forward at StriveTogether to following this approach, this emerging approach that the Higher Expectations team is taking on, so that we can spread it as a potential approach throughout our network of 67 partnerships. And of course, if you're more interested in that approach, as I've noted, our partners from Racine are with us today, so I would encourage you to seek them out and ask any questions you might have. Really the biggest benefit of this principle-based approach is that it creates the conditions that we need for our theory of action to work. This is critical because our theory of action is our secret sauce. It is a balance of disciplined execution, rigorous accountability, and inspiring progress. And I feel like it's necessary for me to stress this again. We didn't build this somewhere at our StriveTogether offices in Cincinnati. We actually work with our network to build the theory of action based on what we're seeing happening in communities, and we've revised it 4 times. So the theory of action that you have is the latest and greatest revision, and that was thanks to countless network members sharing with us sort of what is the key work to build this type of infrastructure in communities. And as I said earlier, the theory of action is designed with 6 gateways that guide communities as they build the civic infrastructure. And those 6 gateways, again, exploring, emerging, sustaining, systems change, proof point, and systems transformation. The objective, of course, is to get every community through the gateways to a place of true sustainable transformation, where systems are organized around children and families instead of institutions. Imagine that for a moment. Systems are not currently organized in that way. I think we all know that. That's why we have the results that we're getting. But that's really what we mean when we say we're working to get communities to systems transformation. Of course, we would love to see all 67 of our communities get to systems transformation. That's why we wake up every day. But we have set an ambitious goal to getting 24 communities to systems transformation by 2023. That's our new 5-year strategic plan at StriveTogether. And so everything we do is about moving communities in that direction. And that direction is defined by a place where at least 4 of 7, note we are now at 7 cradle-to-career outcomes with adding that employment outcome, are improving. But then at least 4 critical disparity gaps within those 7 outcome areas have been reduced or eliminated. So for us, this is critically important that we are not only looking at outcomes improving in the aggregate, but we want to see gaps closing. And we also believe that the only way that this is possible is if what we call them adjacent sectors, if adjacent sectors are engaged in the work. And that's housing, health, transportation, public safety, all of these, the food security, these all play a role in getting those outcomes improved and disparities eliminated. And so we are also looking at communities where at least one of those adjacent sectors also sees improving outcomes. And we're seeing more of our partnerships working very closely with their local housing authority. Also, transportation is often an issue that contributes to that chronic absenteeism. Health is always critically integral to this work that we're doing. So we're really standing by that. Our hypothesis is that a community operating within what we call systems transformation, so hitting those indicators, will put a child on a path toward economic mobility. And it's a high bar, and it can't be reached overnight, of course. But it's an energizing North Star for the communities with whom we work. And as we operate as a network, we very much set these goals together with our network members. So the gateways are steps on a journey, and each step of that journey is driven by 4 streams of work, which we call the pillars. First, there's shared community vision. We begin by working with people throughout a community to create one vision that everyone can support. And we start that by, in order, kind of one of the first steps in a community is to bring all of the data together and aggregate it across the cradle to career continuum through a baseline data report. And this is a very important step because it's often the first time that the community can see a holistic picture of the data in a community. Most of the data across those 7 outcomes are scattered in different places, so pulling that data together is critically important. And that can kind of galvanize and bring partners together around that shared community vision. But then aggregating that data is only the first step. The next thing we do, which is critically important, is we disaggregate the data. So all of that bringing all of the data together, then needs to be disaggregated because we want to help communities see the forest and then the trees. And you really have to see both to make wise decisions, particularly on which subpopulations we need to be focused on. Because as I mentioned earlier, that disaggregated data shows you very quickly where the disparities lie in the community. The second pillar is built on evidence, and this is the compass for our framework. Throughout every community's journey, we're working to support them to gather, assess, and act on the evidence in front of us. And I've seen this time and time again. The evidence and the data erupts, and then it really disrupts the status quo. It can be very challenging in communities, but I will say that I love it when it happens because it drives accountability with inescapable precision. And what emerges is that culture of rapid-fire continuous improvement, which is how communities really accelerate their progress through the gateways. The third pillar, collaborative action, is built with a bias toward action that's taken together. So very simple, but not so simple. From the outset, community members are involved in the co-development of solutions in this work. They're aligned on the vision, driven by evidence, and committed to seamless collaboration. And what I love about this pillar is it's not abstract at all. It's all about action, all about doing things, trying things, testing things, learning what works and what doesn't, then scaling what works and continuing to improve. Oftentimes it's about failing forward, and that is something at StriveTogether and through the network. We believe we have to test, we have to try, we have to fail, and that's how we're able to move forward. So that's the spirit of collaborative action. It gives people the courage to try and test some things and keep moving forward. And investment in sustainability is our fourth and final pillar. It's focused on capability, capacity, and influence. We figure out where we need to have the greatest influence on policy, through advocacy, and through mobilization. We then engage investors to ensure that we have enough sustainable resources to do the work. So we all know that philanthropic resources are a small fraction of what it takes to do what I'm talking about doing, to transform communities, to make sure to put every child on the path toward economic mobility. And that's what excites me so much about these 4 partnerships in Wisconsin and the work that they're doing together, working very closely to partner, to influence state policy, to drive more resources to what works in communities. So it's really exciting that they are very committed to working together, to identifying solutions and to advocating for this type of change, and they are a model for our network in the work that they're doing. So, and it's critically important for investment in sustainability, this particular pillar, because it is, this is long-term work. It's not going to happen overnight, and there has to be the infrastructure. These people that you see on this side of the room who are doing this work every day, there needs to be investment. And the good, I think something that we learned early on in this work is that we have to keep funders involved in every step of the journey. So all funders want to see results, but in our model, funders help to deliver the results. They don't just demand accountability. They're one of the partners at the table. They share the accountability. And most of the time, as they get as engaged as everyone else, sustainability that's really how sustainability comes. Funders realize their contribution to the mess, their contribution to the systems. And I don't mean to pick on funders. They are critically important to this work, but I think that having them engaged in the work is a critical way to change systems. And so what I hope you can see here is the interdependence of our framework. It's a matrix, which can seem overly complex, but it really is pretty simple. As I said at the outset, the principles guide us, ground us, the gateways guide us, and our pillars drive our progress from cradle to career. The best way to bring this to life, and I've shared a few examples, but I'm going to share a few more examples from how the partners are doing this in their work. And the first example that I want to share is from Spartanburg, South Carolina. It is a great example of how a shared community vision can galvanize action and resources. So Spartanburg Academic Movement, or SAM as it's known in the community, is a partnership that brings together a broad mix of players. So it's a countywide partnership, but there are 7 school districts in the county, and they bring together community organizations, Chamber of Commerce, and a range of policymakers and other partners. And although although the partnership works across the entire county, SAM and its partners have used data to prioritize the most high poverty districts within the county for specific interventions. So one example of that is their Floor Schools project. And SAM has worked to build a culture of continuous improvement at 4 high poverty and high need elementary schools. One of those schools is the Cleveland Academy of Leadership, and they're actually using improvement science to reduce student absences. So you can hear a common theme here. Chronic absenteeism is a consistent contributing indicator in so many of these examples. But building on the initial success of this work, SAM is actually now working together with StriveTogether to help teachers use continuous quality improvement and improvement science in the classroom for all that they do. And what is perhaps even more inspiring about the nature of the partnership, that it's expanded beyond the work that happens in the classroom, which is so critical, but really it's expanded to those examples of systems change that I mentioned. So in the case of Spartanburg, the county council recently enacted a policy change that ensures that tax revenue from local businesses is more equitably distributed across the county. It used to be a business would move into the county, and wherever that business located, that particular district would get all of the funding. And typically it was not co-located where some of our higher poverty districts were within Spartanburg County. So as a result, now poorer school districts in the county will receive funding even when businesses are not located in their districts. So that's just one example of a positive systemic change that the collaborative was able to make there. Another example that I wanted to share comes from Austin, Texas. And they are using evidence-based decision-making to accelerate change across their community. Our partnership in Austin is known as the E3 Alliance, and that stands for Education Equals Economics. And they are out to create the strongest educational pipeline in the country because they believe there is no better way to ensure long-term prosperity in the region. And one of E3's many strengths is operating with a unique sense of transparency when it comes to data sharing. So, for example, they've made student-level data available in real time to all key stakeholders. And so this decision is not only informing the practices and interventions that they focus on and scale, but it's also leading to policy change, and it really helps to keep the partners in the community engaged. E3 does a great job of leveraging data and relationships so that partners use effective strategies and provide equitable opportunities for every child. One specific example is when the state of Texas passed a law, or passed a bill that made Algebra 2 and any math beyond it optional for students. So you're probably asking, why would they do that? And I would say probably resources. But this is despite the fact that the data clearly shows that students without more advanced math courses have a very limited opportunity for post-secondary success. But E3 and their partners were undaunted by this legislation. They worked together with partners and districts across the region to ensure that historically underrepresented students have access to more rigorous math courses, regardless of what the state law now requires. And so as a result of their collaborative leadership, the number of students enrolling in algebra by the 8th grade actually increased significantly. And the really great result in this is that teacher mindsets shifted as well. Teachers are now far more likely to set high expectations for all students, regardless of other factors. So this is the kind of progress that really just builds momentum for more. One final example comes from Dayton, Ohio, and this is an example of how a data-driven partnership can build community to better support outcomes for kids. So the partners in Dayton and Montgomery County, Ohio, recognized that far too many children were underprepared when they arrived to kindergarten. So through their regional partnership, Learn to Earn, they set out to increase access to high-quality preschool. And they led focus groups across the community to help people understand the barriers to high-quality pre-K preschool programs. So the fact that people couldn't get that many families couldn't access high-quality preschool programs. And then they mobilized the community to pass a tax levy to support universal pre-K. And I don't have to tell you all, I know it's election day here, so I don't know I don't need to tell you all how hard it is to get voters to increase their own taxes. It's nearly impossible in most cases, but in 2016, which was a historic election on many cases, Dayton voters did just that. They approved an income tax hike to commit $4.3 million a year to universal preschool. And what's even more incredible is actually right down the road, an hour down the road in Cincinnati, where the Strive Partnership works. The Strive Partnership did the same thing. Very similar process to mobilizing the community to support and fund through a tax increase. In that case, it was actually held within the local school district levy, but still made an incredible tax contribution and shifted public dollars to fund universal pre-K. So this is just an example of the type of work that a partnership can do. And in Dayton, I should mention, they're not letting up. They now have universal pre-K in the city of Dayton, but they're continuing to advocate so that they can spread this across the county, because there are other high need areas in the county where children do not have access to high quality pre-K. So these are just a few examples. I could definitely share many more, especially from the partnerships in this room, because we are seeing really inspiring progress from all of the communities across the network. But hopefully these three examples help you understand sort of the approach that we're taking and share our enthusiasm for the approach and the outcomes it's producing. I think the core strength of our approach and our framework is that it's detailed enough to be implemented with real precision, but it's basic enough that it can actually be explained with 5 simple words, which is, we're better together than apart. And I want to be very clear about this. I feel like I've taken this time and I've gone through the process and made it seem simple, and that is not the case. And we are also not running any victory laps here. There is still a tremendous amount of hard work to be done. This is why we raised the bar with adding, our theory of action I mentioned. We revised that in the fall, and we added a new level, that systems transformation, along with the employment outcome. Systems transformation is new for us because it wasn't enough. It is not enough to see communities moving and improving outcomes in aggregate. We want to see those disparities reduced. So each community in our network is progressing at its own pace through the journey, and no single community has yet achieved systems transformation. We have 11 proof point communities, and I expect we'll continue to have proof point communities who are seeing those outcomes in aggregate and those examples of systems change, but we're really working to get to systems transformation. But the progress is encouraging. Just a little bit on our results. I mean, 61 of our partnerships reported outcomes trend data last year. So we do an annual assessment of our partnerships. And you're probably wondering, you have 67, why 61? Well, there are some newer partnerships who don't have trend data. So of the 61 partnerships, 59% of the network saw 3 out of 6, because again, we didn't have the employment outcome yet, so I have to kind of explain that. But 3 out of 6 outcomes improving from cradle to career. And importantly, 46% of the network partnerships reporting trend data improved outcomes for African American students, and 48% of those partnerships improved outcomes for Hispanic students. So we're starting to see some specific population outcomes improve. We also do have examples of gaps narrowing and closing in our network. We haven't been collecting that data as consistently. We are just starting to collect that now that we've set the goal of systems transformation, and we're starting to see some really positive examples of gaps close as well. But of course, these results, as I just shared, came from our own assessment. And over the past 5 years, we've actually worked with an independent evaluator, an evaluation partner, Equal Measure, to help examine and validate the framework that I just shared, so our theory of action. And throughout that evaluation, they found the following. They found that our approach provides tangible lessons for communities that are seeking to do this kind of place-based cradle-to-career work. They found that it's a practical blueprint for building a strong civic infrastructure, and that it's a strong framework for collective impact that's data-driven, equity-focused, and community-powered. But they also drew 3 really important conclusions, and this is what makes us very excited. First and foremost, civic infrastructure, so building these community partnerships, does develop according to our gateways. So this validates the gateway approach that I mentioned. It tells us that even highly complex infrastructures in communities will start to merge into a single interdependent system if a community moves through the gateways with discipline and intention. Second, communities tend to advance with a pace and sequence that's unique to each gateway. So for this gives us insights into how civic infrastructure develops through the journey, and has actually helped us make refinements to our theory of action, so that when we begin to work with new communities, I mean, this is the benefit from new communities who want to work with us. They get to learn from all of the mistakes, and they get to work with a more refined theory of action. But this Equal Measure work has essentially validated our theory of action in many ways, because the third is that our principles, those 4 principles, are present and consistent across virtually all partnerships. And this reinforces that guiding every new community through the same set of founding principles and really grounding them in that work is both essential and effective. So all of this is affirming. It gives us confidence that our framework is working. It points us to continuing improvements that we can make, and it holds us accountable for even greater improvement in the years ahead. But we're never satisfied. Complacency just is not in our DNA. And when I say we, I just need to say, for probably the 4th time, I'm talking about the whole network. The network is not satisfied. We are encouraged by the results that we're seeing, and we remain critically focused on improving every single day. With a little bit of hope, a whole lot of evidence, and a deep commitment to achieving truly better outcomes for our kids. So I'm going to be able to take your questions here in a moment, but I want to leave you with just 3 simple thoughts, 3 things that I've learned since we started down this path in the work. First and foremost, the most unstoppable force in the world is the moral authority of an empowered community. And so Brittany Packnett, whom hopefully many of you know, she's an amazing speaker, former TFA, Black Lives Matter advocate, and we were fortunate enough to have her speak at our convening last year. And someone asked her the question, what is the best thing that you can do to help a community go from mobilization to empowerment? Kind of a complex question. And I loved her answer. She said, get out of their way. And the only thing that I would add to this is let the children lead. They know more than we ever think that they do. We're seeing that across the nation as youth voices are rising and really making change. And so it's important. I shouldn't say let the children lead. I should say let youth lead this work, but really get out of their way. Brittany could not have said it better. The second lesson is really ignite optimism. When starting up a partnership or working through this work, it is important not to be timid. It is important to set bold goals. It is important to hang in there, find the low-hanging fruit, continue to celebrate this work because it's long-term work and it's important to stay optimistic, to remember every single one of those numbers are children, and there's nothing more important than the work that we're doing. And then the third is data informs this work, but it's really words that inspire. We always talk about coupling stories with data, and especially the words that come from the voices of the people we serve. And so on that note, I am going to close with the words of one of those young people, a remarkable young man named Christian Page. He is one of our partners, and he reminds us of who we are, why we're doing what we're doing, and the impact that we can have as we strive together. So let's watch Christian.
They called us low income. They called us at risk. Always speaking from a deficit, didn't realize that my learned experience was prerequisite to be a leader in this community. How could you ever really know unity if you've never seen the broken? They tried to slam the door shut, but my man Tim held it open. See, they forgot to call us scholars. Forgot to call us knowledge-dipped sociologists, unapologists, polished with dreams of being our brother's keeper long before it was common in politics. See, we were the seeds that nobody expected to be trees, but we tend to supersede expectations. Defy statistics. Never standing complicit. See, leaders aren't just in our titles. It's synonymous with our existence. We were the roses that grew from the concrete, became the garden that grew from the ghetto, became the forest that grew from the forgotten, proceeded without caution, never waited to blossom. See, this is the part of the story where somebody finally saw them. It started in a garage. Humble beginnings in this early stage where teachers who cared worked extended days without extended pay just to see their students walk across that prestigious stage and not holding regular diplomas. No, see, these were degrees for change. They gave us the tools, watered our seeds, never looked surprised at what their investment would bring, a network full of leaders from the hill to the CD, educated and ready to meet their city's needs. We changed campuses, brought perspectives to private schools, navigated the unspoken rules of colleges that weren't built for us, with stories too unique for the common application, collective determination, and the cadre and formation. We made an impact that could only be measured in scientific notation. We became teachers, preachers, scientists, activists, counselors, lawyers, employers, nonprofit founders, and PhDs. But ultimately, when watered, we became trees. A wise person plants seeds so the descendants will know shade. The investment that was made receives returns every day. What started as little ripples has now become waves, and generational trajectories have been completely changed. Now this is community development. And it doesn't start with tall buildings, renovations, or detaining our youth. It starts with homegrown leaders unafraid to speak their truth, able to bear fruit because they're connected with deep roots to a city that raised them and respects what they do. When the community stands together, the mountains become movable. Lights in the collective are too bright to be dimmed. We didn't love these cities because they were beautiful. Our cities are beautiful because we love them. So don't call us anything that starts with a deficit. Call us leaders, call us change, call us scholars, call us trees, and discover what happens when you decide to water a seed. Call us the future, and watch us as we continue to bear fruit in what they told us was the desert.
Thank you, Christian, and thank all of you for your interest in our work. And I'm really looking forward to engaging in a dialogue and hearing your questions. But first, I will turn it to Tova.
So thank you so much, Jennifer, for this wonderful presentation and for the important work that you do with all of your colleagues and your partners. And thank you to all of the partners in the room. I'm excited to hear more about your work as we move into conversation. So I'm going to be fairly brief and then open it up, since I'm sure that many folks in the room are looking forward to asking questions and engaging in discussion about all that we've just heard. I'm going to just pull out one theme that I noticed and then pose a couple of questions to get our conversation started. So the first thing that I wanted to say is just to comment on a theme that strikes me through your presentation is just a theme about balance. So you talk about these 7 different points on the career to cradle continuum, and thinking about these different developmental periods or kind of milestones that are so significant along the way. And you remind us about the importance of balancing a recognition of the importance of each one individually, and then also thinking about this as a trajectory and how we have to be focused on that bigger picture and not kind of get lost in the trees. You started by talking about how place and race and education all matter and holding each of those in balance, and then talked also about balancing how the data can inform the work and then the words to inspire the stories. And then thinking too about these core principles that you've identified that are relevant across all of these contexts, but then also how your framework has to be agile and responsive to cultural and contextual factors, kind of local circumstances. So I'm really struck by how you hold all of these things in balance and how you've come up with a model that is both very complex and also kind of can get boiled down fairly simply, as you've said. And so I'm looking forward to kind of talking more about some of the nuance there. One thing that I wanted to mention too, I was thinking about this when I saw the cartoon that you put up. So that was pretty striking, and it was certainly familiar to me from my background of work as a home visitor, and usually as the voice for early childhood in the room in meetings with folks who care a lot about kids and families and communities, each of whom has a particular area that we are focused on. But one thing that I thought, if I was drawing that cartoon, and I couldn't because I'm not an artist, but one thing that I would add to that cartoon was people were pointing to the professionals at each stage, but then often what I would hear too was pointing the fingers at families. So you would say all that, and then you would also say, but really this is about the parenting, what isn't happening at home that should be happening at home, and you're putting kind of too much on us. And so another thing that I really kind of appreciate that came through loud and clear in your presentation was thinking about how you center the voices of children and families in the work that you do and engage them in the decision making for the community, and even just modeling that for us today with your presentation, really pulling out the voices of children who are at the heart of the work that you do. So I really appreciated that. I also was really struck when you mentioned, as you were talking about your theory of action, that it's been revised 4 times. That is something that you don't always hear people talk about, but it was just really pointed toward, the culture of continuous improvement that you were trying to encourage your community partners all to engage in, that, even at the level of your organizational structure, you're kind of open to that revision and thinking about how you keep improving and kind of stay dynamic and relevant too as you continue in your work. And then I was also struck when you mentioned thinking about adjacent sectors. So just recognizing kind of, how expansive and inclusive our focus needs to be if we're thinking about really coming to the really high bar that you have set for yourselves of system transformation. So I really just want to thank you for this presentation, and then I'm going to just pose a couple of questions to Jennifer to get us started. And so my first question for you, I think I'll ask them one at a time to give you a chance to respond, but the first one, you spoke at the start about the powerful words of Dr. Odell Owens and how his words prompted a shift for you from your previous focus on college access to recognizing the need to focus on equity in education from cradle to career. And I suspect, so I gave the example in my own work, background in early home visiting, and now my research centers on early childhood and parenting at the transition to parenthood. I'm sure that many of us have particular kind of moments or, areas that are where we center our work. And I wonder what you would advise us in terms of thinking about our work and positioning it as part of larger efforts to support positive trajectories from cradle to career.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Tova. So as I mentioned, I started my career focusing on doing very deep work in college access and attainment, and there's so much work to be done there. So I can certainly resonate with the focus going very, very deep in one of those areas, and that's critical work. And we need that work to happen because there is so much to be done. And I know that, like we work very closely with the grade level reading campaign that is solely focused on improving outcomes for grade level reading. And then of course there's the National College Access Network that is very much focused on that college access work. But when it comes to community, I think what is critically important and has been a learning in my work is that focusing on college access in the way that I had, what it really comes to is looking at that data. I mentioned kind of aggregating all of the data in the community and thinking by the time that the students' population got to my point in the work, so many students had fallen off the pipeline, out of the leaky pipeline, I think our friends at the Forum for Youth Investment call it. And so I would encourage those of you doing deep work in one particular area in a community is to look for those tables, look for your partners doing work across outcomes and share data and set some shared goals. And this gets back to that shared community vision. If you have an existing cradle to career table, obviously I would say, please go be a part of that work. But if you don't, how can you look across these outcome areas and share goals and know that you have a population of children that you're responsible for and that, sort of holding on to not letting any of those children fall off the pipeline on the progression from cradle to career. And that's much easier said than done. But I think finding the community tables that exist that look across the pipeline. Oftentimes in communities we find it's a local poverty table. There are more and more mayors in communities, mayors in cities taking on poverty. And so just thinking about how all of those outcomes are contributing to poverty and the adjacent sectors as well and connecting with those partners in the community.
Thank you. So the second question that I have for you, sorry for making you sit down and get up, right, stay over here. So my second question is you presented some incredible stories of progress and impact, and I'm very inspired by what you shared. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges of the work. So, you acknowledged as you were presenting that in particular when you think about the work of changing mental models and shifting power dynamics, that is really difficult work and that you encounter resistance at times in that work. And so I'm hoping you could tell us just a little bit more about what it looks like when you encounter some really entrenched resistance, and how you've worked to overcome that, what's been effective.
Another great question. What I talked about a lot is that our work is not only about outcomes changing, outcomes improving and reducing disparities, but changing systems. And so systems are made of people, and changing people is really hard. So getting to the shifting mental models, this is incredibly challenging work, and it requires a special type of leader and leadership capability in communities. So at StriveTogether, we have actually been investing a lot in building leadership capability. We actually have developed a StriveTogether leadership program, working very closely with the Annie Casey Foundation and their Results Count leadership work to help arm leaders. And when I say leaders, I'm talking about leaders at all levels in the community. So some of the young people that you heard there as well, building the capability of these leaders to do adaptive leadership, to really understand sort of what people are holding in systems and why it's hard to shift, and what are some of the strategies that can help shift those mental models and move people. And it's not easy work. This is one of the biggest challenges that I would say, and I look to the experts in the room who deal with this every day, but there's always resistance. I can think back to when I was doing the work on the ground in Cincinnati, just running into campaigns and different efforts and national efforts coming in, and we're going down a path and there's something new, and then some of the local leaders would get distracted by that. So it really is centering around data And adaptive leadership is so critical. If you've looked at Heifetz's work around adaptive leadership, I think that is a foundational piece of work that we're arming our partnership leaders with, so that they can help build this capability within the community to get past that resistance. But it is a challenge.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it up now to folks who have questions for Jennifer.
Thanks. Really interesting presentation. So I'm hoping you can kind of walk us through, how does the community get involved, and like who is in, who's part of the partnership, and maybe one of the local partnerships could talk. But I'm just kind of curious, like, how does this start? How does it work? How is it funded?
Yeah.
Like, kind of what's the behind the scenes?
Yes. Well, I would love if some of our partnerships want to add to this, but I can just start by saying it looks different in every community. And so when I think of these 4 communities, I would say each community had a very different start. So usually it is a group of local leaders, maybe community foundation leaders or chambers of commerce and others who are already, oftentimes I want to acknowledge that these types of tables, cradle to career work, or sometimes it's starting at K-12 through post-secondary, they often exist in communities, and I think they've existed in some ways and not had a clear path forward. So a lot of times it's existing tables coming to us and saying, we've heard about this work down the road or in a happening in Texas, and we want to learn more, but it looks different in every community. It really does, and we call it a coalition of the willing. What we tell communities when we get a call, we get lots of calls from different communities saying, we read about you in this, or we saw this SSI article on collective impact, and we want to do this work. We have learned that we can't really start with them until they've gathered the coalition of the willing. It's like, who are the people in your community? And you know that, we don't. We can't tell you, go get your community foundation CEO and your chamber CEO and your United Way head, because in different communities it looks different. In some communities it's like, nope, the United Way will not be for this, but we want to do this. So it does look different, but what we tell communities is who are the most important people that you need to kind of get this started, and where's your coalition of the willing, and then we can help give you a process and share best practices from other communities. Would anyone? Yeah, Danae.
So Danae Davis, Milwaukee. We're 8 years old. We started, our community foundation leader, Ellen Gilligan, actually came from Cincinnati, so she was familiar with the Strive partnership, and what she knew, what she had going for her in her inaugural years as president of our foundation, the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, was that the foundation's board had prioritized educational outcomes, and particularly elimination of disparities, as a priority for their work. And so she was able to bring the collective impact model that is now StriveTogether to Milwaukee. The critical thing was, from get-go, as Jennifer said, she assembled a team that was representative. We have some of the most challenging education, let us call them wars, in Milwaukee that you may be familiar with. We are both public schools, charter and choice, and so all had to be invited to the table, the mayor, you name them, they were all invited. The neat thing about it is, by her assembly of a community as broadly as you can think of it, she was able to keep probably 90% of those who started with us in the beginning are still at the table through the network work that gets people actually engaged in building what are the interventions going to be, cradle to career, and then continuing to work on who's going to own it as opposed to the backbone staff. So funding was important, who you picked to be in your, having a broad tent, so to speak, and being absolutely committed were the keys to getting quick bright spots that then keep people committed to it, because collective impact is so, so hard. I can't even begin to tell you how hard it is.
Yeah, Spencer.
Hi, Spencer Bonney from Green Bay. So we have a similar but somewhat different story to tell in Green Bay. As an organization, we're about 5 years old, but the work actually began a number of years before our organization became into existence. It was originally initiated by the United Way through something called a life study, which brought together a number of community partners and leaders throughout the community to identify both assets and needs within our community. From that life study, another group convened as a follow-up and identified 10 different areas that were deserving of our community's attention related to this work. From those 10 different areas, we then narrowed that list down to 6, and it was about that time that Achieve Brown County, which is the name of our organization, took shape and aligned with StriveTogether using the StriveTogether model. Right now, our work is very much driven by a much smaller group of core partners consisting of healthcare entities, school districts, other nonprofits, and a very small handful of community leaders. One of our challenges is actually re-engaging the broader community in our work. So as much as a broader coalition of entities and individuals was very much involved on the front end of this work before our organization even existed, we're now at the point where there's a bit of a disconnect between us, our partners, and the larger community. So what our board is telling us, asking us to do, as we talked about in our drive down here today, is figure out how to tell our story better and re-engage the community in our effort. There's good work being done. We're very blessed to have some core partners who have been with us from the get-go and are really helping to drive our work, but we need to re-engage our broader community more. Many people do not know about us within our community, which is a challenge. We're not going to be successful unless we're able to, again, re-engage the entire community in our work.
Hi. You talked about needing to meet 4 of these core indicators to be a proof point community partnership, and I was wondering, does that just mean increasing the level of the indicator or also reducing the gap? Or how do you...
Great question. So to be a proof point partnership, you only need to demonstrate that you are trending positively, so your outcome's trending positively in aggregate. Now, systems transformation, that's what we've raised the bar actually and set a new set of indicators for our systems transformation gateway, which is about closing gaps. So to be a systems, and we don't have any systems transformation communities yet, but when we do assess communities, so we have, and I didn't get into a lot of this, but we do a rigorous assessment of communities to understand, like we look at their data each year through our assessment, but we also do a systems change assessment. So with systems transformation, we will be doing a systems transformation assessment to look at how systems have shifted at a deeper level to sustain gap closing, the gap closing. But we will also require communities to show that they've closed at least 4 critical disparity gaps. So it's a high bar, and this again was set together with our network, and we are confident we'll get there. So.
So I was pretty impressed to hear that you had in the E3 program data sharing in real time with all your partners. That sounds amazing. So I want to hear about that story. Yes. But I also want to hear about how do you work with organizations to help them use data and increase their capacity and ability to, really make meaningful change and do research with it.
Yes, great question. So on the E3 data system, so we have some real great examples of amazing data infrastructure in some communities, and then the majority of our communities need this. There's a lot of spreadsheets and trying to make the most of the state longitudinal data system. This is imperfect. We have been trying to figure this out since I've been at this work. When we launched in Cincinnati, we built our own dashboard. Now, 10 years or 13 years later, I'm hearing from the Strive Local Partnership that dashboard is almost obsolete. So data infrastructure to do this work is a critical need, and we're working with some partners and trying to kind of figure out how to do that. E3, that is a strength of theirs, and many of the partners in the network are envious of them for that. But really how we work with partnerships to build their capacity to use data. This gets back to the theory of action and sort of the framework is oftentimes it's leveraging existing assets in the community. So a higher ed institution can be an incredible partner for building capacity to use data in a community. So we're, all of our partnerships, it is one of the critical staff. So one thing I didn't mention is who we have in the room here are partnership leaders. So partnership staff who are this is a critical need in communities. There has to be an investment to dedicated support. So when you asked about also how you get started, we also say you have to dedicate some staff to this work. So it is securing the resources and funding to have people who think about this all day, every day. And we tried to see if this could be part of someone's work. It can't happen. It has to be dedicated staff. So to your question on the data, all of our partnerships have data managers as a critical team member. So they are experts, typically have some data capacity and expertise. Oftentimes we find in partnerships that the data manager role is a shared position with the partnership staff and the district, which can get them good access to district data. We also work with communities to build data sharing agreements. So we've partnered with the Data Quality Campaign to build a toolkit around getting through all of the data compliance, data FERPA issues and all of the data privacy issues. And communities really, they leverage one another. I didn't speak enough to the network effect of the work. So learning from one another as partnerships in terms of how they're getting through some of these data challenges. I mean, we do capacity building and technical assistance with communities that is around using data, but often it is about who or are there resources in your community. So Spartanburg Academic Movement, I mentioned, they have BMW is headquartered, or they have a headquarters there, and so BMW as a corporation has actually loaned staff, or loaned, this is part of their corporate responsibility, is to loan data scientists and Six Sigma kind of quality improvement experts to support the work of the Spartanburg Academic Movement. Milwaukee Succeeds has done the same thing with GE, and other partnerships are leveraging those resources in the community to do the data work, because as you have noted, it is so critical to our work, but it is a very technical skill that most communities don't have at the ready, so we have to figure out how to leverage those existing resources. Oh, sure. Sure. So one of the things that we do is we are fortunate now to have a major investor who has invested in our work and we've had many major investors invest in our work to not only support our technical assistance that we do with communities, but also to provide partnerships with financial resources. So we are passing through philanthropic resources to partnerships to hire staff or capacity or consultants to do this work. And then we're also working with them in a cohort. I mentioned that leadership capability building is so critical. That StriveTogether leadership program, we bring together 5 or 6 partnerships into a 9-month leadership program where we're really working with them to build their capability, to build capacity to do this work. And the goal there is to accelerate their progress towards proof point initially and then to systems transformation. Looks like there was a question in the back. Maybe. I don't know. Sorry.
Thank you. It's clear that you help the willing and those who want to help themselves. Mm-hmm. But coalitions don't hang together. School boards can be a pain in the ass. People don't want to share data across silos, and I could go on and on.
Yeah.
What would really be useful is if you could show people, if you could develop sort of a way of working through some of the common roadblocks that you run into and how to get around them. It seems to me that would be a way. I mean, clearly you have to, I can imagine lots of reasons why this doesn't work. It works some, the dashboards are great. But for instance, every state education board now is developing young professionals. They're all every student succeeds, gives them lots of room to do their own things. I work with the WT Grant Foundation for a long time, and each of those is a hothouse or a bed where they can develop the dashboards, which is exactly what you need. They can provide some leverage sometimes on the school boards. They could help engage the people that you have, too. So I like what you're trying to do, and if people are willing and they'll hang together, it looks like you can make a difference. But how to best predict how that will work, it seems to me, is the challenge now. And if you run into this roadblock, what do I do? And you could become a consultant in a sense. Groups that are trying to make a difference.
I think you've hit on something. Thank you. You've hit on something very important, and this is an important role that we play at StriveTogether in our and as a network. You're right. There are very common roadblocks. The one that I mentioned around data sharing agreements. We had so many partnerships struggling for years in our early days of existing just to figure out how to get districts to share data, how to get past the school board who didn't want this part. We experienced that in Cincinnati, a lot of school board resistance. And so the work of having the network of 67 partnerships, and we do convene them regularly. We do a big annual convening, and we do smaller convenings through the year. And I say what I hear from network members over and over again, it's a great time to do some group problem solving, group therapy, have some drinks, and just talk about how hard this work is. And then we do create resources. We at StriveTogether, we didn't have as much capacity until recently. We are very fortunate that we have some large investors who are interested in this work, but our goal is to produce more resources and lift up more learning from the work that's happening on the ground so that we can help communities get past those roadblocks. But you are absolutely right. It is much easier to do this in communities that want this work. I've tried, we've had many partnerships. We were at, it's worth noting, we had 70 partnerships at the end of last year. We were at 67. 3 of them went away. And that is real. And it's hard for us as a team every time we lose partnerships who can't keep this work going, or there's just not the willing people in the community. But it doesn't mean we're going to keep going. But you're hitting on something very important, and we do see it as our role, and I know these partners in the room see it as their role to help communities get through those roadblocks when they come up.
So my question is, in your work, what type of research is useful or informative? And what do you think is the role of academician in your organization or in your work?
That is a great question. So I do want to, I can actually ask our partnerships to respond to this too, but I'll respond first. So our view is research is critically important to this work. It's how we identified those 7 cradle to career milestones when we initially looked at a scan of the research on children successfully moving cradle to career. We worked very closely with the University of Cincinnati because we were working in Cincinnati at the time just to launch the Strive partnership, and that's how we used the research there. I will say that we have a bias, as you've probably heard in my remarks, towards using real-time data to do continuous quality improvement. And so we are not, our work does not, we feel such a sense of urgency that we can't wait for the randomized controlled trial, the quasi-experimentals, that some programs and interventions do are using, because in our work we believe that we can get access to real-time data and use that to drive improvement. It doesn't mean we see research as a critical component of looking at what are some of the national best practices where there are research, there's an evidence base behind those best practices. But our advice to communities is not to necessarily lift that best practice and bring it to their community, because oftentimes what we see, and what has been shown time and time again, is that what worked really well in Chicago is not necessarily going to work in Birmingham, Alabama, even though there's a huge research or an evidence base behind it. So, I mean, you're asking a really good question. I think we could be, I will admit that I think we could be more thoughtful about how to engage with academia in their research, but I do think that they're, and this is someone who I mentioned my background. I mean, I'm a higher ed student affairs person. I embrace academia and what it is, and I think I'm a reformed person who has also found that it's so slow sometimes. And when you feel a sense of urgency in this work, it's hard to wait for the studies. So it's a great question. And yes, Chelsea.
So a couple of things in Racine that particularly resonates for me as a question. First, as Jennifer talked about, we're trying to do some really in-depth targeted work around our employment issues. So you guys probably have all heard of Racine recently because we got Foxconn, oh my God. And one of the driving community forces around Foxconn coming into the community was that we didn't want to see it leave City of Racine residents behind. So the vision of Higher Expectations has been a fully capable and employed workforce for 5 years. We've been working to try and move more people out of poverty and into sustainable employment for 5 years. And Foxconn came, and there was a huge resounding community message of this cannot just be a thing out by I-94 that ruins life even more so for the community members in Racine. And so around that time, we actually asked UW Parkside, one of their economics professors, to do a study and to do some really in-depth research on what are the drivers of unemployment, specifically in the city of Racine as it compares to other communities, similar size, as it compares to the county outside of the city limits. And what was incredible and really timely is what we found is that not only do we have a ridiculously low post-secondary attainment rate, in the city it's 26%, with associates or higher, but also compared to similar sized cities and similar economic realities that they are facing, we have a really significantly large number of female head of households. So 22% of City of Racine households are female head of household, which is what drove us to create a two-generation strategy and framework. It was completely designed around data that had come from a local researcher, because that actually, it really does drive our work. And I will also say that as you are working with and evaluating those programs and those best practices and finding that evidence of programs that work, what we have found is that using that evidence and being able to share that with our partners and some of our most skeptical partners, we've got some seriously conservative partners at our table in Racine that have a lot of political power, that saying we're going to bring this, but we're going to do it the Racine way, and we're going to use continuous improvement to then take whatever was really impactful in Cincinnati or Dallas and do it the way that will work here. Without that first introduction to it being, proven and evidence-based, it gets rejected. So it's actually been really important for us to ground ourselves in those academic studies and in that research, and then continuously improve with serious urgency. And so our executive director, my boss, always says it's a both and. How can we do it all? And so I think leveraging our research partners, to do it sort of parallel to this continuous improvement work and the work that our data manager does to support programs as they continuously improve, that's something that we try to do in tandem.
Thank you. Thanks, Chelsea.
Thanks, Jennifer. So I actually have a comment to build on Chelsea, but I also have a question. So I'm going to start with my comment. So there has been a lot of interesting conversations happening in the academia circuit around, the benefits and what's gain and loss due to the fact that scholars are very mobile. So even, when we go to grad school, we usually leave the nest and we fly somewhere else. So there is not necessarily the benefit of really immersing oneself in a community and really getting to know that community. And even for many people who try to do that, then they often go somewhere else. In my prior capacity, this was my life, and I was sort of the hybrid because I was a doctoral student and I was, well trained as a researcher. But one of the things that I really benefited from, but also I tried to encourage other folks to do, is that it's not that the research itself is inherently bad, but there is this both this technical piece of it, like how do we interpret good research? How do you understand a sample, characteristics, and thinking about what that means for driving those effects? So when, in my process, after we've done sort of the data disaggregation and we've identified a driver, we go to the literature, we try to see what it looks like. There's good models where there's an evidence base. But then we have a conversation with this community of experts, including people who have this research expertise. And there's this dialogue between, okay, so this is what our community is, and that researcher also knows about the specifics of that community. So we can then begin to think about, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this study as being implemented in this place, and how might we adapt it in ways where it has a better chance of being effective and things like that. So that's my sort of plug for, there is very much a role for academia and academic research in this process. So the second the question I had was actually kind of piggybacking on Tim's comment. So there was one thing you said that led me to think of the potential of spillover effects. I think you were talking about Dayton, Ohio, that there was a sort of this process began there, and then there was interest in other from surrounding communities. Yep. And so I thought of two things. One of the fact that it's true. That there are some communities that are more primed right now to start that work, but I'm not sure that the other assumption that the communities that aren't can't become. And so I'm interested in thinking about, or sort of any narratives or stories or evidence you have to share about how that spillover effect, that cultural shift may be happening through this work. And then the second thing that I wanted to get your thoughts on and have you lift up is the role of engagement. So you talked a lot about that in a sense of using the community and stakeholders to help identify the willing. But I know that the other role that they play is they literally help us understand the politics, right? And so even in some cases, I would think that, or I think that sometimes even in a less than desirable environment, potentially with the right strategic lens, one can go further than one might expect with this work. You might not be able to go as far as you'd like, but you probably could get a lot further than you think.
Yeah, no, so great questions, and I appreciate your build on Chelsea's example, and I think I do want to just comment before I will answer your questions, but comment on that. I think what you described in the process, and thank you, Chelsea, for raising that example, that is absolutely what we encourage. The thing that I think we do discourage in our work, as I mentioned, is just the wholesale lifting of a practice or a program, which we experienced at least a lot in Cincinnati. And that was what I spoke to the funders being frustrated. They're like, well, we just brought this program here and this didn't work, and we just brought this here. So it is really leveraging existing the research assets in the community. And I love Jeff, Chelsea's boss's idea of both and, because as Chelsea could attest, and Jeff would as well, we're always pushing a little bit there, but he is always pushing us as well, and so it's good. So on the spillover effect, I think what I was understanding from your question, I do think we see that a lot. Certainly we have quite a few states where we have multiple partnerships, and as exemplified here, they're working closely together to support one another in the building of this work. I also want to be clear that It's not that we, and I don't know that I said this, and I may not be answering exactly your question, but I do want to be clear that our goal right now is to getting to those 24 communities to systems transformation by 2023. So we are not actively out there seeking new communities. In fact, we don't do that. We never have done that at StriveTogether. Communities who want to do this work come to us, and honestly, there are some communities where it is so much harder. And you can look at our map of 67 and you can see places where we're not, and places that are harder, large metropolitan areas particularly. And so the work has been critiqued. Rural areas as well. We're actually right now working with Save the Children. We have one really rural partnership. We have a few others who are somewhat rural, but a rural partnership in Berea, Kentucky, who is helping to inform how we work with rural communities. So I think that the biggest thing here is that, even to Tim's question earlier, is we haven't figured all of this out yet. We look for those examples of spillover when practices are lifted from one community to the next, or one community strengthening another, and the idea of a state coalition. But there are certainly communities where it's much harder to do this work, and I think you'll continue to see our theory of action and the way we work with communities evolve as we learn more from those communities. So I don't know if that is a helpful answer to that question. And then now I've lost the second one. Engagement, yes, thank you. So on engagement, so yes, you saw, this is the way we view engagement. I will say that this is a recent refinement to the theory of action, and I actually wrote about this with the current director of the Strive local partnership in Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky. He and I wrote a SSIR article last year about the evolution of engagement in our work, because I can fully admit that when I was doing this work 13 years ago, we looked at engagement as communicating with diverse stakeholders and then going forward with the work, and not as authentic as co-developing solutions. So the way we view engagement and the way we're supporting partnerships to do engagement is to really engage community in a different way, engage stakeholders at all levels in the community in a different way, and have them to co-develop the solutions. Leaders in the community don't necessarily have all of the expertise. And so that is really hard work. And I mean, you heard from Spencer what they're dealing with in Green Bay, getting the community re-engaged. Like, it's a constant process, and every one of these partnerships has experienced that, and Cincinnati is experiencing that right now. You're at this work for 13 years, you lose people, and you have to reconstitute the partnership. So your question is fair. The examples that you see, I mean, we do have emerging examples of really authentic elevation of community in driving solutions, and that the youth voice work in communities is real and is really driving better solutions, but it is hard work that our partnerships are figuring out. So I know. Yes.
So I let it go a little bit long because, as expected, such a great conversation. But please continue the conversation at the reception just out and to the right. Thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful talk and great comments from Tova. So yeah.